companies are facing growing pressure to increase revenues, cut costs, innovate, be more flexible, and continue to enhance shareholder value. Likewise, in-house legal functions are required to demonstrate what value they bring to the organization, usually in dollar terms. With this in mind, any organization not responding to these contracting challenges is essentially eroding shareholder value. I know that in-house teams usually have capacity constraints, but when you see the size of the prize, you will understand why legal teams need to start focusing more on post-signature contract management and value leakage. Essentially, contracts are assets and instruments of economic value. The value lies in the outcomes they produce. Legal considerations are fundamental, but not their primary purpose, which is to enable business between two or more parties. So in addition to being an economic arrangement at their core, they are also a life cycle activity supported by team, task, technology, and insights working within a wider system. Value creation opportunities exist in each stage of the contract lifecycle. The business needs to capture this value. If organizations are able to manage the life cycles of their products, why do legal teams struggle to do this with their contracts? So on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see there are two big numbers that I want to draw your attention to. One being 10% value leakage, which is a significant number in dollar terms, and the 60% reduction of time it takes to finalize contracts, which means quicker go-to-market for businesses. And usually, this is one of the biggest issues that businesses have with lawyers, is that they're often perceived as business blockers and not business enablers. Justin will speak about this more later. But today, I'm going to focus on value leakage in the post-signature part of the contract lifecycle, an area that does not get much focus from legal teams. Lawyers tend to focus on the pre-signature drafting and negotiation of the legal terms. So even if you don't have a CLM solution currently in place, today's topic will help you build a business case to implement a CLM solution in your organization, because the numbers involved can be significant. If done correctly, a CLM solution can be self-funded. So now that you have the broader context, I'll move to value leakage in more depth. This slide highlights some of the key numbers that are based on real case studies in organizations I've worked closely with. On the sales side, in one organization, we uncovered revenue leakage, which equated to nearly 1% of revenue. This was in an organization with relatively mature contracts function and where the processes were fully integrated into the wider opportunity to cash and source to pay end-to-end business processes. I would estimate that less mature organizations may experience leakage of up to 4% of the sell side, maybe higher. When we expanded the value leakage program to include buy side, we saw similar percentages in value leakage. Yet World CC, formerly the IACCM, have research to show that this number could be as high as 10%. So if you're an organization with revenue of $1 billion, then you're potentially losing 10 million in value leakage, assuming a conservative 1%. So if you can even plug half of that, any savings generated would pay for 2 enterprise CLM implementations in a year. So let's look at the problem. This slide shows examples of areas where we have tracked revenue leakage in an organization's sales contracts. This formed the basis of a post-signature contract management process developed by the legal team. It was this process and methodology that uncovered revenue leakage of up to $350 million in 1 year. Similarly, on the buy side, factors like wasted resources, maverick spending, poor supplier performance, scope of work issues, logistics and warranties were shown to foment value leakage. So I suppose the question is why? How on earth could an organization, leak $300 million in value with a relatively mature contract management process and technology in place? This slide highlights what the aggravating factors were that drove that leakage. So beyond the multiple stakeholders, they had their own priorities. There was misaligned processes and multiple systems. For example, there were multiple ERP systems because of various acquisitions over the years. Invoices were generated in different tools depending on the business unit. The contract and review and negotiation process in legal was aligned, but not optimally, with the opportunity to cash and source to pay processes. Sales did not use a dedicated end-to-end contract lifecycle tool. They built their own using a combination of CRM, tendering, business process management, and reporting tools. Sourcing and procurement used Ariba. Therefore, leakage was not always identified because nobody was looking across the entire value chain. This is when the legal team stepped in to determine whether leakage was as bad as the function thought it was. So initial pushback from a number of internal stakeholders believed that the legal team was wasting their time. But after 3 years, they had no option but to take notice, especially since everything was well documented and the numbers were significant. One of the challenges faced by the legal team, though, was capacity. But once we demonstrated the size of the prize, the value leakage program was prioritized and capacity added via right sourcing and a restructuring of the contracts function. So we'll move quickly just to a brief case study. So this slide is a case study on how an organization that was running 28 separate contract databases was putting an increasing strain on the IT function with an accompanying increase in costs year on year. So this is a US-based, actually Houston, organization. And so along comes Hurricane Katrina and Rita. The GC wanted to have an overview of what the various contracts said about force majeure, but there was no single searchable database. So you can imagine the frustration that this generated. So CPChem, by virtue of learning from this, decided to implement an enterprise-wide CLM solution. So by implementing that solution, there were significant cost savings and value leakage reduction just by virtue of the fact that processes were improved and more data was available to the legal team. I mean, for an initial implementation of and having savings of 7 to 9 million year over year is not insignificant. And in addition to this, there were a number of documented efficiency improvements, which you'll see on the right-hand side of the slide. And this was all brought about by applying systems thinking to contract management. And by systems thinking, I mean how the team, the task, the tech, and the insights are interrelated within the legal function and within the wider organization. My point here is that when we think of building a business case for CLM, in other words, how do we justify a CLM solution to the CFO for budget purposes? Lawyers tend to think of trying to quantify the cost of legal risk and lawyer efficiency improvements. But much of the risk is actually hypothetical because it doesn't always materialize. You know, lawyers draft thousands of contracts without incident. So quantifying those savings is always a challenge. Was it a great legal mind or just luck that a contract was implemented without any legal problems? But lawyers understand contracts. So if there's one function that should have the ability to manage contracts across their value chain, ensuring that the multiple stakeholders are all aligned, then it is the legal team. So with this wider view of legal's role in contract performance, building a commercial business case with a return on investment using hard numbers becomes possible. I've already highlighted earlier how big some of these numbers can be. So you may be asking yourself, what does a post-signature contract management process look like? Where does one start? So here's an example of a post-signature contract management process that we built previously in 2010 to identify value leakage in commercial contracts. It's not a cookie cutter approach, so it needs to be developed around the particular needs and structure of the business, but this will give you a good idea. So in this example, we built a 5-step process that starts with selecting underperforming contracts for review purposes. Underperforming in this instance were contracts that were not meeting the expected contract value halfway through their life cycle. We called it a midterm contract review, but basically it's a contract audit. Steps 2 and 3 were about the preparation and the actual audit involving members of the contracts team and other key stakeholders from finance and operations. Steps 4 and 5 involved identifying the actual leakage, which was then, which may have been recoverable or not, as the circumstances dictated. And then a remedial work plan was created for each contract to try and recover the leakage. So in each circumstance, we also built a feedback loop back into the processes so that we could see how the identified issue could be avoided going forward. And this could be, something simple as a change in process, or something maybe a bit more complex in terms of an amendment to a contract because it involved negotiation with the counterparty. So my team and I built this back in 2010 and 2011 when most of the processes were manual. But in a digitized environment, and with the advent of legal artificial intelligence and robotic process automation, many of these steps can contain elements of automation. The availability of increased contract metadata brought about by digitization also drives greater business insights. Nick will speak about this later in the webinar. A final note on this. This cannot be a side of the desk project. To identify the leakage numbers I'm talking about, you need a defined process and methodology. You need capacity. Some team reorganization may be required. And post-signature contract management objectives need to be part of a team's KPIs. And if you can get sales and sourcing to share them, that would be first prize. Cognia can assist you with all of these critical factors. So in conclusion, these are the key messages I would like you to take from today's webinar. Number 1, value creation opportunities exist in each stage of a contract lifecycle. Legal needs to leverage the post-signature stage more to demonstrate its value to the business. 2, CLM is not just about the technology, but also the team, the tasks, and the insight. Optimum business outcomes are achieved by excelling in all 4 of these pillars. And then finally, value leakage reduction by the legal team can be used to build a business case for a CLM solution. The numbers are significant. So post-signature contract management focus can easily fund a CLM solution and still deliver value straight to the top and bottom lines of the business.